Okay. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi. So before we get started, does anybody have any questions that I can answer before we plunge? And as I've said before, if you have a question, I'm sure other people have it as well. So don't be shy.
Well, a little tiny question.
Yeah.
Is, what does capital C, capital E stand for in the
Common
reading?
era.
Common era.
Common era. Yeah. We don't use AD, I mean, which is Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord being born. And we don't use BC, which is before Christ. We use BCE before the Common Era and CE for the Common Era.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Christine?
My sister-in-law Jane had a question, and she said, "Please say it was from her so that I don't get blamed."
Okay.
She said that, I mean, she's Jewish, and she said, "I can't find anywhere where where it refers to lighting candles on Shabbat." She said everybody does it. We all do it. But she said she was trying to find a reference in Torah for it. And she
no,
couldn't
there's no
find
reference
it.
in Torah.
Yeah, there is no reference in Torah. Here we go. It's a
Right.
custom.
Yeah, it's something that the rabbis, came up with.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask people to mute themselves just so we don't get an echo.
Yeah.
And I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so today we're talking about mourning and funerals and death, which I think Judaism is very, very sensitive to the different phases of the process of mourning. So here's the first thing which I want to, this is an answer actually to Doug's question. Doug said, what happens if there's a fire on Shabbat and you're a fireman? What happens if whatever, there's a need for an emergency, worker? Well, pikuach nefesh, which means saving a life, takes precedence over every other mitzvah. We're obligated to take action to save a life, even when it involves setting aside almost all other mitzvot, because these are the mitzvot that one shall do and live by and not die by them. So you can break just about any mitzvah on Shabbat if it means saving somebody's life. So does that answer your question, sort of?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay. So, all right, when someone gets sick, we gave them a prayer for healing, and it's called the Mishaberach, which means the one who blesses. And it's basically, may the one who blessed our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, our matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless and heal the one who is ill. You say their name, the daughter of. May the Holy Blessed One overflow with compassion upon them, to restore them, to heal them, to strengthen them, to enliven them. Send them speedily a complete healing, refuah shlema, that's a complete healing of the soul and healing of the body, along with all those who are ill among the people of Israel and all humankind, soon, speedily, without delay, and let us all say amen. So this is what you recite when someone is ill. And not that there's magical thinking here about, oh, we're going to do this prayer and, the person's going to magically get better. It's a prayer for healing, which means hopefully getting through whatever it is a person's going through as smoothly as possible, and also having them know that we are thinking of them. And I think there have been some studies showing that when you pray for someone and they know you're praying for you, it really helps with the healing. Now, believe it or not, this is something that probably will be surprising to you. Traditionally, there is a confession that you make when you die. It's called a vidui. That means confession. And so obviously there's a very brief version, if you don't have the energy or whatever to say a longer one, or the longer one. I acknowledge before you, my God and God of my ancestors, that my healing and my death are in your hands. May it be your will that you heal me with refuah shlema, full healing. And if I die, may my death be an atonement for my sins before you. May my portion be in heaven, and may I be privileged to the world to come, reserved for the righteous. And then there are, some other things that you can recite, biblical verses here. I don't think I've ever actually done this for anybody, because I think most of the people in the congregation don't even know about this, and I'm not sure they would even want to do it, but it is traditionally what's done. Now, also traditionally, you have a Hevra Kadisha, which is a burial society that prepares the body for burial with a ritual washing and dresses people in a simple linen shroud. It's a great big mitzvah. Now, there's no Hevra Kadisha here in Riverside. And if you do want to have this done to the body, you have to go to LA, get LA, to come out here. And everyone's supposed to be buried in the same way, which is in a simple shroud in a plain pine box with no metal, which we'll see in a moment as well. Now, when you hear that somebody close to you, and we'll talk about who those people are, when you hear that they die, you're supposed to do kriya. So once upon a time, and in traditional communities, you would tear your clothing and put sackcloth on and ashes and all that. In the Reform movement, we tear a ribbon that looks like this picture here. We just tear the bottom, and we say a blessing, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, which means blessed is the just king or the just ruler. And it's an acknowledgement and an acceptance of the reality that, okay, this is not something we want, but we're accepting that that's the reality. So there's 7 principal mourners. So for these people, you are supposed to go through certain rituals. So that's for your mother, your father, your sister, your brother, your son, your daughter, and your spouse. Now, I realize that these 7 mourners were, written up before we had more kind of fluid gender. So there probably is a better way to write this up now, but sort of get the message as parents, siblings, children, and spouse. So the first thing that happens is you're an aninut, which is from death to burial. And the mourner at this stage is called an onen and has no religious obligations except to attend to the practical necessities of arranging for the funeral. And what they would arrange for, would be having a Hevra Kadisha come and take care of the body, wash the body. Also, the body is not supposed to be left alone. And so there's somebody called a shomer, which is a guardian who is going to recite psalms while they keep the body, company. Of course, traditionally, you're supposed to bury the body within 24 hours. That's not even possible right now, even in LA, because of COVID. They just don't have the capacity. So even in really traditional communities, it's taking several days to get somebody buried. Out here, we have the Riverside National Cemetery, which is a military cemetery. And unfortunately, there it could be weeks. Anyway, now we had a congregant die at the end of January, and his funeral isn't going to be until February 24th. So it's really hard on a mourner, because there are these very specific periods that you go through that are really based on how you're feeling and what you're capable of doing. And to have to wait a full month before you can bury somebody, you can't even go into the proper stages of mourning. You don't even know where you are, and you don't have any closure. So that is another very difficult thing about the period we're going through. So the funeral includes some prayers that we're going to look at, some psalms, El Malei Rachamim, which we will look at, the mourner's Kaddish, again, we're going to talk about that, and a eulogy. And there's something called Kavod Hamet, which means respect for the dead. So, you know, the eulogy is not going to say nasty things about the person. Hopefully it's as honest as possible without being nasty if the person happened to be, you know, particularly unpleasant. So Psalm 23 is a standard for funerals, Jewish funerals. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And there are a lot of translations. This one, I kept the sort of more traditional one with he, but there are lots of ways in which to do this without calling God Lord, without calling God a he, but he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, what I usually do, by the way, is I definitely will include something like Psalm 23. I might include something from Proverbs, you know, a woman of valor, for example, or something from Ecclesiastes. You know, there's a time for every season and whatever. But I also will, you know, pick out more modern poetry and prayers that I think are particularly appropriate for the person who's passed on. So El Malei Rachamim is where I'm going to read the English because then I'm going to play somebody actually singing it. So it's God of compassion, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure, who shine in the brightness of the firmament to the soul of our dear, whoever it is, who has gone to his or her eternal rest or their eternal rest. God of compassion, remember all his worthy deeds in the land of the living. May his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. May God be his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And let us answer, Amen. Okay, before I share the video, I just want to see if anybody has any questions so far. No? Okay, so this is somebody who's going to chant El Malei Rachamim, which means the one who is full of mercy.
Hi, I'm Sarah Wolf, and I'm going to sing the prayer El Malei Rachamim, which is often said at funerals or at a gravesite. And this prayer asks God to grant rest to the soul of the deceased person. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, B'malot Kedoshim Utorim, Kezar Harakia Mazirim, L'nishmat Shalach L'olamo, Began Eden Tehei Menuchato, Ana Bal Rachamim, Yastireu Beseter Knafecha L'olamim, Utzor B'tzor Chaim et Nishmato, Adonai Unachalato, V'yanuach B'shalom al Mishkavo, V'nomar Amen.
I got to turn her off before she starts singing again. Okay. So it's kind of a beautiful, haunting piece that we sing. Now, I'm going to share a couple of other things. Where'd it go? Here it is. All right. We just saw that. Okay, so we're told, you know, that we came from dust and to dust we're going to return. And we're all going to be buried in a plain pine box. The idea is, first of all, no fancy coffins, you know, because you're rich. Everybody's supposed to be buried exactly the same. And no metal, because metal is associated with weaponry. So we don't want to have any metal in there. And it's supposed to be just a box where, you know, you go back to the earth. You go back to being dust. And the easiest thing to do is from a pine box as opposed to something with metal that would make it very hard for you to go back to what you're supposed to go back to. Okay, the mourner's Kaddish. So I'm going to read it in this transliteration, and then I'm going to show you the English, and then we'll talk about where this actually comes in. So the mourner's Kaddish, first of all, is in Aramaic. So it's not even in Hebrew. So it's a similar, you know, the language is similar. It's got a similar alphabet and grammar, but different forms of the verb. So just listen to it and see what it evokes for you. Yit gadal v'yit chadash shemei rabbah ve'alma divrach yehute v'yamlich malchute v'chayachon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael v'agala uv'zman kariv imru. Amen. Yeheshmei Rabba mevarach le'olam l'olmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitale v'yitalal shemei dekudashah b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehesh lama Rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Ose shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru. Amen. Does anything stand out at all as you're hearing this?
There seems to be a lot of repetition.
It's a lot of repetition. As a matter of fact, that's what this is. This is called a doxology. It's a complete praise of God, which we'll see in a moment when we do the English. Anything about the sounds of the, you know, obviously you don't know what all the words mean, but.
Seems that a lot of
There's
them,
a lot of, oh, sorry.
A lot of what?
it seems that a lot of them start with V, so there's probably an intonation pattern of action with the V. That would
Okay,
be
the
my
V
guess.
means and. Okay, yeah. There's a lot of V's. There's a form called the heat pa'el for the verbs. The heat, the yeet. You get that over again, especially yit barach v'yit tabach v'yit pa'ar v'yit romam v'yit naseh. So there's this. It's almost like Om. You know, if you're doing some kind of Zen meditation, there's something meditative about these repetitions. Okay, let's look at what it means. Then we're going to talk about what the mourner's Kaddish is. So that orange line is simply the design of this particular slide. It is not underlining anything. So glorified and sanctified be God's great name throughout the world, which God has created according to God's will. May God establish God's kingdom in your lifetime and during your days and within the life of the entire house of Israel, speedily and soon, and say amen. May God's great name be blessed forever and to all eternity. Blessed and praised, glorified and exalted, extolled and honored, adored and lauded be the name of the Holy One. Blessed be God. Beyond all the blessings and hymns, praises and consolations that are ever spoken in the world, and say amen. May there be abundant peace from heaven and life for us and for all Israel, and say amen. The one who creates peace in the celestial heights, may God create peace for us and for all Israel, and say amen. Okay. So let me just tell you about the history of the mourner's Kaddish. So Kaddish, does that sound like it resonates with any other word that you know? I'm sure somebody, you can unmute.
Well,
Beverly.
Kadesha,
I'm sorry?
Kadesha.
Well, kadosh, right?
Kadosh.
It's okay. Kaddish is kadosh in Aramaic. Okay, so it has to do with holiness. So as I said, it is a doxology. All it does is praise God over and over and over again. You saw all of those synonyms and all the repetitions that you heard in the Aramaic. So initially, this was a prayer that was said at the end of study, which is why it's in Aramaic, because that was the language that was spoken in the first century. So it was a prayer that you said at the end of study, praising God. There's a blessing you say before Torah study, and you'd say this afterwards. Then it sort of migrated into the service. So it became like a punctuation mark during the service. So after you'd be done with a certain section of the service, you'd have what's called a chatzi kaddish, which means a half kaddish. It's a little bit shorter. And then in the medieval period is when it became a prayer for the dead. And this is the story that's told. It's apocryphal, certainly. So you have Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is a very famous, important rabbi in the Talmud, and very, very loved and very revered. And so he's one day in a cemetery, and he sees a ghost carrying a heavy load and working like really, really hard. And he's going, what's the matter? Why are you working so hard? So, well, I have this punishment because I was a horrible person. And, I can't, like my soul can't be released until something happens. I was so bad. I was a tax collector, of course, who likes tax collectors? And I was really mean about it. And I got a woman pregnant and she had a child, and I don't even know if I had a boy or a girl. So Akiva goes into town and tracks down the child. And of course, it's a boy. And he teaches Torah to the boy, because that's what you're supposed to do, which is what the father was supposed to do. And he teaches him a similar prayer to this one. And when the son goes to synagogue and says this prayer, the father's soul is released. And that's how it somehow morphed its way into the mourning rituals. If you want to know more than you ever wanted to know about the Kaddish, Leon Wieseltier wrote a book called Kaddish. And you may want to take a look at it. As I said, if you want to know every reference that ever was made to Kaddish. Now, he interestingly does not have any footnotes in his book. So he used to be the literary editor of the New Republic. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Slightly misogynistic. I think he's another one who fell by the wayside as a result of Me Too. But anyway, very smart, very, very learned. And what he did was he realized when his father died, he decided he wanted to follow the ritual of saying the mourner's Kaddish. So here's what you're supposed to do. If any of your close relatives die, the ones that I gave, your kids, your siblings, your spouse, and your parents, you're supposed to follow, the different stages of mourning. You're supposed to say the mourner's Kaddish every day for 30 days. For your parents, you're supposed to say it for an entire year. And of course, traditionally, it's only the male children who say the Kaddish. So obviously, well, I actually have done a funeral for somebody, and the person brought the Chabad rabbi. And when it got to the mourner's Kaddish, you're supposed to have a minyan of 10 adults to say the mourner's Kaddish. And he wouldn't count me as one of the adults. So Beverly relates to this, I'm sure. Yes. So you're supposed to say the mourner's Kaddish 3 times a day for your parents for a year. And that's why Leon Wieseltier wrote the book, because he didn't know much about Jewish rituals, and his father died and he decided he wanted to do this. And of course, trying to find a minion of 10 adults, especially if you're looking for 10 men, is not so easy. They have to be Jewish. And they also have to be observant, supposedly, you know, so. Now, why are you supposed to do this? We're going to see in a little bit what happens to your soul after you die. But theoretically, you obviously were all good with some moments when we were not so good. So we don't have a pure soul. So we go to this place called Gehinnom. We'll revisit that in a bit. You go to a place called Gehinnom, which is almost like a purgatory. And you're there until your soul is purified. And to help the soul become purified, as a child, you recite the Mourner's Cottage 3 times a day for your parents, and that helps their soul go back to its source. That's why you do it for a year. Now, in the more traditional communities, they only do it for 11 months. Beverly, do you know why that is? Okay, so they only do it for 11 months because you do not want to assume that your parents got the full year, because that's the longest you can get. So you don't want to assume that your parents were possibly going to get the full year. So you just do it for 11 months. You know, who said there wasn't some kind of superstition in Judaism? Okay. Any?
Rabbi, just really quick. So a year is the longest you can be there?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, Kim, who is not here today, emailed me a question, which was very interesting. She says, but during services, we're always saying the Mourner's Cottage for people who died in the Holocaust. So we're doing it for more than a year. And that's not why we do it. It's because you say the Mourner's Cottage 3 times a day for your parents for a year. When it's the yahrzeit, which is the anniversary of their death, you say the Mourner's Cottage. And then there's several services that have something called Yizkor as part of them. So for certain holidays, there's a Yizkor, which is a remembrance, and that's 4 times a year. And that's another time that you say the Mourner's Cottage. Well, people who died in the Holocaust, we don't know when their yahrzeit is. So like my grandparents, for example, who were killed in the Holocaust, I can't say, oh, it's March 1st, time to say the cottage for them, because I don't know when they died. So I just say it all the time, and in case I hit the right day. And that's why we do it that way, to try to honor them. And we say, for people who don't have anyone to say the Mourner's Cottage for them, because they might not have children alive, or they might not have family, and it's a way to show respect for them. Any questions? Ellie.
So just like when you were showing the box that we're supposed to be buried in, is cremation an option, or no because of the Holocaust, or?
Well, that's a very interesting question. First of all, in traditional Judaism, you're not supposed to be cremated. Because as you're going to see, there is this idea that we are going to be resurrected at the end of time. Now, of course, by the time we're resurrected, our bodies have gone and become part of the earth. So I don't know. But theoretically, all your limbs are like, if there's some kind of a blow up in Israel and bodies are strewn, they go collect the body parts, because you're supposed to be buried with as much of your body as possible. So you're not supposed to do cremation. However, in the Reform movement, we do accept it. I've done plenty of funerals for people who've been cremated. And my mother, who was in Auschwitz, actually wanted to be cremated because she said she wanted to be where her parents were. So, and there was one Reform rabbi in Culver City who had a cremation garden outside of his office. Whatever. I mean, that's really pushing it, because it's not particularly kosher to cremate. But if you go to a funeral home and they try to sell you on some really fancy coffin, don't let them do it, because they're just trying to make money. And it's not the way we do things for Jews. Anything else? Yes, Tammy.
With the idea of body parts being together, is there a concern about donating organs being a problem because you wouldn't be whole? Or is that something that's not addressed?
Actually, again, with that principle of pikuach nefesh, which is to save a soul, save a life, organ donations are okay if it means being able to save someone's life. That's what's inside. So I guess they don't really count the stuff that's inside. They count the limbs and the, yeah. Suzanne.
Yeah, the issue of not being upsold on a casket is a little bit difficult. For my father-in-law's funeral, we tried to get a Jewish casket, and we found a mortuary that would allow us to do it. For my dad's funeral, they absolutely refused. They wouldn't bring it in because they don't sell it. And more and more funeral homes are not letting you supply a casket that's
Really?
Yeah, it's actually much harder than you would think.
Wow.
Because
Well,
they want to be able to sell it to you.
Of course.
And it's not in their stock.
Well, we use Aches Funeral Home.
Okay.
Generally, AKES, they're on Magnolia. And, because Atchison and Graham, we used to work with them very closely. Then they got bought out by a couple of big corporations. And I, would try to explain to them what we do for a Jewish funeral, but they didn't seem to always know. And they're very expensive. So Aches has worked with us a lot. So now the caskets aren't necessarily as plain as I would like, but at least they're all wood with no metal, and they at least get generally what we need to do. It's hard out here, as I said, if you want to have Hevra Kadisha to take care of the body, you have to go to LA. And we'll look at some of the other, like Shiva, and those are difficult to do here as well, because we're talking about people who don't really follow, Jewish tradition very well. Okay, so let me show you the next. Somebody else have a question?
Yeah.
Brandon?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Brandon.
Go ahead, Brandon.
The question I had is, because of the distinction that the Orthodox community has in Israel, does that become a problem as well if you want to be buried in Israel? Is that another one of their distinction points?
Yes, I talked about how you needed to get married by the Orthodox rabbinate. They also are the ones who decide if you can be buried in a Jewish cemetery. So yes, it is a problem. Christine? You're muted.
If cremation is the desire of the family, is there guidance again in terms of simplicity for an urn or for where the ashes are placed?
Oh, there isn't really guidance because it's not what you're supposed to do. So, but I think in keeping with the spirit of the law, you probably, don't want to buy a really expensive urn and all of that. And you can also bury cremains. You could put the cremains in a little pine box, I guess. Okay. I'm going to share my. All right. So when you return from the cemetery, one thing I should have mentioned, which is the mourner's Kaddish is said once you put the casket into the earth, then you recite the mourner's Kaddish. And traditionally, Jews bury their own. What we usually do is a symbolic, like 3 scoops of earth onto the casket, which has a horrible sound, but part of it is hearing that horrible sound and realizing that this is really true. This is really what's going on. That person is really gone. So you come back from the cemetery and you usually have a meal of consolation. And the first week after the funeral is called Shiva, because Shiva is 7, and that's 7 days in a week. And now I know very few people who actually observe Shiva for 7 days, or even 3, which is sort of the reform version of it. If they do 1 or 2 nights of Shiva, that is about the limit. But traditionally, you're supposed to stay at home. The community is supposed to come in and take care of you. And this is the thing about being in an Orthodox community. You have people who really care, who come by, who do whatever. Something that you sometimes don't get in other communities. But of course, then you also have to, follow along, thinking and acting the way they believe you should do it. So there are pluses and minuses. And the mourner is supposed to remain at home and not go out. And that's why you have what's called a Shiva minyan. So for the service in the evening, usually, instead of going out and going to a temple or congregation to do the service, people come to you so you don't have to leave the home. And it's called a Shiva minyan because, again, to recite the mourner's Kaddish, you need a minyan of 10 adults. All right, I'm going to share another video with you, which is to tell you a little bit about what happens during. Get this out of here. Okay. Yeah, there it is. Okay.
The word for funeral in Judaism is levaya, which means accompanying. To accompany a person to their final resting place is an act of love and kindness for both the deceased and their family. The funeral may start at a funeral home, a synagogue, or graveside, and there are a few practices worth noting. Men, even non-Jews, are often expected to cover their heads. Don't expect an open casket, as it's traditionally considered disrespectful in Jewish practice. Note there probably won't be any flowers, as they represent life, and this is a time about death. Depending on the community, it's unlikely you'll talk to the immediate family of mourners until after the funeral. The funeral involves prayers, psalms, and a eulogy. After the service, the pallbearers are generally called to the front. Everyone rises as the casket is carried out. Immediate mourners walk behind the casket, and everyone else follows. At the cemetery, the pallbearers carry the casket from the hearse to the grave, where it's then lowered, and you say a few more prayers. Then each person shovels or throws a handful of dirt onto the grave. Some do this 3 times. Don't hand the shovel to the next person, just stick it back into the dirt, as this powerful and important mitzvah is an individual obligation. At the conclusion, you'll form 2 parallel lines that the mourners pass through, a symbol of the community joining together to show support. While they walk through the line, one thing people say is Hamakom inachem etchem, or simply, may God comfort you. When leaving the cemetery, it's customary to wash your hands without drying them, a symbol that you're leaving a place of death and re-entering the world of the living. Now begins the Shiva period, with many powerful rituals to learn about. Learn about the customs of Shiva and how to make a Shiva call in the next part of this series.
All right, I'm going to try to do the other one. Let's see where. I have to stop sharing for a second in order to. Please stop. Okay. It's hard to do everything at the same time, but I think this is going to work. Okay, here we go.
Jewish mourning customs are specifically designed to make sure that the mourner has time and space to grieve, away from their daily routine, and to help you, their friend, make sure that they are comforted and sustained. Often while a Jewish mourner is at the funeral, community members are preparing a space, usually a family home, for the period known as Shiva. The mourners stay inside to reflect on the life of the person who died, receive visitors, pray, and grieve. Mourners are not expected to entertain, rather the opposite. The community provides meals and a comforting presence for the mourners during this period. Don't wait for an invitation. It's an important mitzvah to visit your friend at the Shiva home after they've lost their loved one. You may witness some customs that seem unusual, such as the covering of mirrors, the mourner sitting low to the floor, a tear in their clothing, or the burning of a 7-day candle. Any questions?
When do I visit?
Shiva is traditionally observed for 1 week following the death. If the family hasn't announced or publicized a list of visit times, call the funeral home or synagogue, or give a call over to the house before stopping by.
What should I bring?
Find out if there is a coordinated effort of meals being prepared for the family that you can participate in. Otherwise, a basket of fresh, uncut fruit is a thoughtful and practical addition to any Shiva home.
What should I say?
You don't have to say anything. It's enough to be present. Let the mourner set both the pace and tone of the conversation. Once the mourner speaks to you, you can offer condolences and, if it feels right, share memories of the deceased. Elements of the Jewish mourning process continue beyond the 7 days of Shiva, 30 days for most mourners, and 11 months for those who have lost a parent. It's important for you to be supportive of your friend and help keep the memory of their loved one alive for the years to come. Some ways to do this are by making a charitable donation in the name of the deceased to a cause important to you or to them, contacting your friend near holiday times when they might especially be thinking of family, or attending synagogue with them for the anniversary of their loved one's death.
Okay, so the way one is supposed to go and greet a mourner is based actually on the book of Job, because in the book of Job, for those of you who know it, the friends come to so-called comfort Job, but then they get more and more angry at him for 30 plus chapters because, Job is saying, I did nothing wrong. I do not deserve this. I want justice. And they're coming from the Deuteronomic theology that I think we talked about a little bit, which is if you obey my commandments, all will be well. If not, you're going to be punished, says God. So if you're being punished, then logically it must mean that you have done something to deserve this. And Job says, no, I did nothing to deserve this. This is not right. And the friends get more and more angry at him and give him all these cliches, which I'm sure some of you have heard. I mean, in the case of Job, they're really more accusatory. But you know how people will say to you, oh, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. The person's in a better place. No. Do not say any of those awful cliche things. It makes things way, way worse. So at the end of the book of Job, when everything is restored to Job, except for his dead children, the friends now come to comfort him again, and they are doing it in a way that is appropriate, which is that they do not initiate the conversation. They come in, they're there for him, they wait for him to speak. That's what they were saying in this video as well, that you allow the mourner to speak first and, kind of follow their lead. And if you are also in mourning and you're at the, at the synagogue or at the funeral home or at the graveside, you do not have to be polite. This is not your job. Your job is to mourn, and people should understand that. Of course, a lot of times they don't. For the Shiva minyan, as I said, people in my congregation, for the most part, have done one evening, which would be the first evening after the burial. But just think about this. If you have somebody who died and it's a month later that you're going to bury them, you can't go through any of these. I mean, you sort of try to go through Shiva for the first 7 days because that's the most intense period, but you're not really going through it because the person isn't buried. It's just really crazy. Shay.
Yeah, two things. I just love the community and how the two lines formed. It really got me teary-eyed for a moment because in the Christian faith, you don't see a lot of that. It may be different. But the question I had for you was the mirror, covering in the mirror. What does that mean?
well, again, this is in a traditional community. My community does not do this at all, but you're supposed to not be, kind of worried about how you look or whatever. You're just supposed to focus on your mourning. Usually the shivas that we do here in this congregation, we do a service. It's like, it's the evening service that you do, and then you have some time to reminisce about the person who passed away and to say a few prayers related specifically to mourning. And then everybody eats. No, the Jewish joke, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. Yeah. So there's always going to be food and, lots of cakes and cookies and whatever. Any other questions? Okay, so let's go on to the next period, which is Shloshim.
I had a question.
Oh, okay, sorry.
It's okay. For the Shiva minyan, do you need 10 people still?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so it's called a Shiva minyan, Shiva because it's during Shiva, and minyan because, okay, there's certain prayers in Judaism that you need 10 adults to say. One of them is the Kaddish. One of the other ones is the Baruch Hu, which is the beginning of the service, the sort of official beginning of the service. So anytime you're praising God in that way, or there's also the Kedusha, which is a very long prayer that you probably haven't run into because it's done on Saturday morning, not on Friday night, but it's basically expressing the holiness of God. And if you don't, again, you have to have a minyan for that. You sort of have to have a community to express certain things about God. Brandon.
So in a large Jewish family, would they constitute a minyan while they're in mourning, or would they have to reach the outside Jewish community in order to form a minyan?
No, they could form a minyan as long as, okay, you have to be 13 or over to be considered an adult. And if it's, again, a traditional family, they would not count the girls. So that's, yeah, how it goes. Any other questions? Okay, so we're going to look at the next stage of mourning. Did you see this? Hello?
Yes.
You do? Okay, good. All right. Because sometimes it's hard to see what is being shared. Okay, so the next stage is Shloshim. Okay, so that's the first 30 days. Actually, the first 30 days includes the 7 days of Shiva. So it's really, from the 7th day, so it's like 23 days really, but it's called Shloshim because it's the first 30 days. So during Shiva, you're not supposed to leave your house. You're not supposed to work. Shloshim, you can go back to work, but you're not supposed to, let's say, go to a party or, actually, you're not supposed to do that for the whole first year if it's your parents. So it's very sensitive to, the first 7 days are going to be the most intense, the first 30 days. And of course, the first year is very hard as well, because it's the first time there's a birthday or a holiday or something without that person. So during the 30 days, and then for your parents, you don't go to parties, concerts, any kind of public entertainment. And as I said, you recite the Mourner's Kaddish for 11 to 12 months for your parents. Okay, the tombstone is called a matzeva, and it's going to look something like what you see here. And it's going to have these Hebrew letters, which if you don't read Hebrew, what I'm going to say isn't going to make any sense. But up at the top here, there's a pei and a nun with like little quotation marks in between. That means it's basically a like an acronym. So pei nun means po nitman or po nikbar, which means here lies. And then you have the person's name. So this person's name is Esther, Bat, daughter, oops, sorry about that. Oops, wrong way. So it's Esther, Bat, daughter of Mordechai. And then you have the date of the death. So this is like, here, this person died on this day, here died. And then you have this is the 18th of the month, because in Hebrew, the letters each have numerical value. So this is the 18th of the month of Shavat. And then this is the year. Now the year doesn't usually include, this is the Hebrew year, right? 5,700 or whatever it was at the time. So the 5,000 is not there, but the first letter is basically 400. The next letter is 300. So that's 700. So it's 5,700. The samech here is 60. And the aleph is a 1. So it's 5,761 is when that person died. And then at the very bottom, you have basically made this person's soul be bound up in everlasting life, or may this person rest in peace is basically what you're saying here. That it's all got these little quotation marks because it's basically an acronym. There are lots of acronyms in Hebrew, but I guess there are in English as well. So the unveiling can happen anytime beginning at 30 days after the person has been buried. So you put something up, a matzeva, a monument, to mark the site. And the unveiling, you actually don't really need a rabbi. And by the way, tombstones these days are flat on the ground because it's easier to mow the lawn, apparently. So you put a piece of cloth over it, and then you unveil it, and it's a very short ritual, like maybe 10, 15 minutes. Then, as I mentioned, on the anniversary of the person's death, and it's usually based on the Hebrew calendar, although some places do it based on the secular calendar. So you light a yahrzeit candle, which burns for 24 hours. By the way, when the person dies, you get a Shiva candle, which goes for 7 days. But here on the anniversary, it's just for 24 hours. And you recite the mourner's Kaddish when you get to services. Okay, so before we go on to the next section, let's see if anybody has any questions. Yes, Bobby or Beverly.
Yes. What about suicide?
Yeah, we're going to get to suicide.
Oh,
we're going to get to suicide. Yeah.
And then I had one other, I don't know if it's a question or a thought, but when I was growing up, there were things that a child could do that their parents would sit shiva for them if they were still alive. But if they did something like my cousin who married a non-Jew and her parents sat shiva, how does that happen? How does it get to that?
Well, I think we better mute. Yeah, it's a lot of echoing. I think that, as I said, if you belong to a traditional community, you have community. Okay, when you're sick, when you're whatever, I mean, there's always someone there to take care of you, to make sure you're never alone. And there's some really great things about that. The negative is that if you don't toe the line, you basically get kicked out or you leave on your own. So if you're in a traditional community and your child is gay, marries a non-Jew, whatever it is, they can't deal with it because they're told that this is not acceptable. And so sometimes they continue having a relationship with their child, but it's often very strained. And then sometimes they sit shiva, meaning they decide, this is not my child anymore. My child is gone. It's very sad, very sad. I remember when I was in Oakland, I had a wonderful senior rabbi, Steve Chester, and a congregant came to him and said, my child married a Catholic woman or whatever it was, and they've done a baptism, and now they want to do a Hebrew naming, which of course doesn't make sense, because the Hebrew naming means you're in the covenant with the God of Israel and not with, Jesus and whatever. And Steve Chester said, go to the naming, right? I mean, you don't want to lose your child because you're standing on ceremony over certain things. Obviously, you know, some things are very important to people, and I guess more important than their own children. But as I think I've mentioned before, it's not just that you might, you know, not share their values. It's that the community is going to put a lot of pressure on you to really keep this person out of your life. And so it's very sad. It's very sad, but that's the way it is, unfortunately. Any other questions before we take a little break? Let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come in at 10 after 2. We're back.
Hello.
Hi. Okay, I hope everybody else is back. So I just want to show you one example of the kind of prayers that I use at funerals, because as I said, I use Psalm 23, El Malei Rachamim. I mean, those are, you know, basically, you know, 2 things that you always use, but there are lots of other, I collect a lot of prayers and poems and things. So I'm just going to give you one example. And this is used a lot at Jewish funerals. Okay. This is by a poet named Zelda, who is she's from a Hasidic family, very religious. And so this is just one example of something that's really, you know, very nice piece to read. Each of us has a name. Each of us has a name given by God and given by our parents. Each of us has a name given by our stature and our smile, and given by what we wear. Each of us has a name given by the mountains and given by our walls. Each of us has a name given by the stars and given by our neighbors. Each of us has a name given by our sins and given by our longing. Each of us has a name given by our enemies and given by our love. Each of us has a name given by our celebrations and given by our work. Each of us has a name given by the seasons and given by our blindness. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death. And that's Zelda, translated by Marcia Falk, who's a liturgist and a poet. So now we're going to talk about afterlife. Now, I know a lot of people think that Judaism does not believe in resurrection of the dead or the afterlife, and that is not correct, because in traditional Judaism, there's a belief in both. So that when Jesus was supposedly resurrected, that was just how people, you know, people believed that at the time, that you could be resurrected. So it wasn't, you know, some kind of really shocking concept. In Reform Judaism, we don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. We believe that the soul is eternal. I'm going to share with you some material. Here we are. So as I said, in traditional Judaism, there is a belief in the eventual resurrection of the dead at the end of time. And the vision for that is in the book of Ezekiel, when Ezekiel sees the bones, the dry bones, you know, getting sinews and muscle and whatever. Rambam is Maimonides, 12th century Spanish rabbi and philosopher. So the resurrection of the dead is one of the principles of faith. We're going to look at the tefillah prayer in a moment, and I'll explain that to you. And it's going to, now, in terms of the resurrection of the dead, the end of time, the messianic age, olam haba, which is the world to come, it is actually not clear how all this is going to happen, because different rabbis have different ideas. Some say the Messiah will announce the world to come, when peace and justice will reign and everything is going to be wonderful. Some people say that the messianic age is the world to come. the Messiah is supposed to come from the branch of, Jesse, who was David's father. There's also some belief that it's from Aaron's line. And eventually in this world to come, people will be brought back to life. Now, will they be brought back to life at the age of 90 when they died, or will they be brought back to life at the age of 21? It's all very unclear. But it is a definite part of traditional belief. So I want to show you the Amidah, which is the standing prayer. It starts off, we say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzhak Elohei. So it starts off with a blessing about our forefathers and our foremothers. The second blessing, which is this one, is a blessing about God's power. Can I ask whoever's not muted to please mute, if you don't mind? Thank you. Okay, so here we say, Atah gibor le'olam Adonai. You are strong. You're a warrior, God. And then you see in the third line, it says, Mechaye hakol, and in parentheses, it says Metim. Mechaye hakol means who makes everything live. And that is the Reform movement change of the prayer, because the prayer originally said, Mechaye Metim, that God made the dead, Metim is dead, God made the dead live again. That is the original prayer. And the Reform movement said, oh, no, we don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And so we can't say this prayer. And so we have to change the word. So they changed it to makes everything live, hakol. Now, the reason you see it in parentheses is that this is from the latest prayer book. They couldn't quite decide what to do. They were thinking of bringing back Metim, the dead, on one side of the book, and on the other side, hakol, which means everything. And understanding Metim, the dead, as, okay, God may not resurrect the dead as in now we're standing up and we're alive after having died, but that in many ways we die all the time. We have a loss, we have a tragedy, whatever, and that God helps us to revive. And so we can understand it metaphorically, which the early reformers apparently didn't understand metaphor because they changed everything they didn't like. So you see in several places here, it says Metim and in parentheses. The annoying thing about that is that means that if you're in the middle of a prayer service, some people are going to say Metim, some people are going to say Hakol. Usually in our congregation, we say Hakol. God makes everything live. And you see there it is again at the bottom. So we say that you are the person, the one who makes everything live or makes the dead live. And Baruch atah Adonai mechaye metim. Blessed are you, Adonai, who makes the dead come back alive. So this is the translated, well, it's a sort of free translation of that prayer. You're forever mighty, Adonai, you give life to all, or you revive the dead. You sustain life through love, giving life to all, reviving the dead, if you choose to say that, through great compassion, supporting the fallen, healing the sick, freeing the captive, keeping faith with those who sleep in the dust, who is like you, source of mighty acts, who resembles you, a sovereign who takes and gives life, causing deliverance to spring up and faithfully giving life to all, or reviving that which is dead. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives life to all, revives the dead. Again, that is the option you have with this prayer book, which is, as I said, a little bit annoying as opposed to having everybody have the same thing. So the world to come. Now, even though I know there have been various people who said to me, well, Christianity is more focused on the next world, and Judaism is more focused on this world. And in some ways that is true. However, the world to come is also important in Judaism. Again, it's called Olam Haba. And as I said, sometimes it's the Messianic age, sometimes it's after the Messianic age. Of course, your place is determined by whether or not you've been a wonderful person and done everything you were supposed to do. And actually, the righteous of all nations have a place in the world to come. So it's not just Jews who go there. But there is a concern in Judaism with how am I behaving in this world and how is that going to affect my place in the world to come? That's much more in traditional Judaism than in Reform Judaism, but it is something that people care about. So here are these, it's sort of heaven and hell, sort of, okay? So the place that the righteous go to is Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, which is not the same place as Adam and Eve's Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. It's a sort of place of spiritual perfection. It mirrors that, but it's not the same thing. Now, if you were very, very righteous, you might go directly to the Garden of Eden. But the average person, as I said earlier, are going to go to a place for some purification. And it's referred to as Gehinnom, or in Yiddish as Gehenna. And it's also referred to sometimes as Sheol. And of course, if you're utterly, utterly wicked, then you don't really get to go anywhere. But most of us fit into the category of being good and bad. And yeah, sources differ on what happens at the end of 12 months, because yes, there is no consistency in Judaism when it comes to these things, because it is not really a Jewish thing to have a philosophical, systematic way of understanding any of these things. Okay, any questions about the Garden of Eden, Gehinnom, the afterlife? Because after this, we're going to get to suicide.
Okay.
Brandon. Oh, I'm sorry. Brandon, and then whoever, I guess, Bobby. Go ahead.
Oh, she can go.
Okay, go ahead. Beverly?
I wanted to know what your feeling is for yourself.
Me too.
About whether or not.
What is your take?
Yeah, about what
on the
happens
afterlife
and where we go and what happens to the soul. I just wanted to know your feeling about it personally.
Well, I mean, I do think that, the soul remains in some form, but I don't know what form. And I don't believe in, being purified in Gehenna or any of that stuff. But I do think there's something that, I hope there is something that remains of us after we pass away physically. Sort of like we're all energy, right? So that energy is not going to just go away, but I can't go too far with any of this because I don't know. Brandon and then Che.
So is it just that there isn't a lot of material to go on? Because, for example, in Christianity, there's a lot of material where it's very explicit of this is what happens, this is the consequence, this is very explicit. Is it just that there isn't that explicit language within Judaism, or is that the language that is provided is vague enough that it causes this kind of shifting perspective?
So I don't think it's really either. So here's the deal. Christians have written theologies, right, about, our relationship to God and who God is and all of that. In Judaism, for the most part, I mean, Maimonides is an exception because he's a philosopher, but for the most part, the way you know what Judaism thinks about something is you look and see what the rabbis say, whether it's in Midrash or Talmud, right? And the rabbis will say, well, God does this or God does that. And we're going to go into a little bit more of that when we do our session on God. But it's not systematic, right? They don't care about that. I think this whole idea of like a systematic, logical way of thinking is very Greek and Western. And the Hebrew mind is much more associative. That's how the Talmud is written. It's really, I think I mentioned that somebody wrote a book called The Talmud and the Internet, because it's very much about association. Oh, we're talking about this. Now we can just go off on some total tangent. And we don't even have to come back to what we were talking about in the first place. So there really isn't an effort to make it all hang together. So you have different rabbis saying different things, and same thing with God, same thing with the world to come. There are just a lot of different ideas, and nobody bothers to sort through them because contradiction is not as much of a problem in the Hebrew mind. if you look at the Bible, there are two stories of creation at the very beginning, and they are kind of contradictory, but the way the Hebrew mind sees this is they're complementary. They're two different aspects or two different angles. So Maimonides is different because he is a philosopher. And then in the, 19th century, when you finally have, Jewish scholars going to Western universities, then they start adopting some of the, philosophical systems. But up until that point, theology is not even a Jewish enterprise. And in fact, when I was in seminary, the class in theology I took was called first medieval Jewish thought and then modern Jewish thought. It wasn't even called theology. And then when I had to write a theology, and I called it fragmented theology. In other words, it's not consistent, and that was fine. It's not a problem. Whereas my friend who became a Methodist minister had to defend her theology. So that's why it's not clear. It's not that there isn't enough information. It's that the information isn't consistent and nobody cares about making it that. I mean, if you ever read the Talmud at all, and we're going to look a little bit at it, but you'll be very surprised to see that there are discussions about legal aspects of whatever, and they don't necessarily come to a conclusion. It's just the exercise of exploring that they're really mostly interested in.
Yeah.
Okay, Che?
Okay.
Yeah, question, with the Christian faith, often you can throw a Hail Mary at the very end and get into heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious, within the Jewish faith, like, is that where that middle ground is for those folks, or how does that, I'm kind of confused a little bit with that.
We're gonna see a story in a moment, and it'll kind of answer your question, but one example doesn't always, kind of work for everybody, but there's a story exactly like that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other?
I have a question.
Yeah, Bobby.
Or it's maybe a comment, but I mean, when I read this, when I did the reading and listening to you, I find this to be one of the most appealing things about Judaism, because it makes it so non-rigid and decentralized and, rabbinical. The individual rabbis are figuring things out, as compared with what I've mentioned this before. I did a documentary on the Mormon Church, and they literally gave me at the time films that they had made portraying heaven. And in these films, people were, dressed in white gowns, walking on clouds and meeting their loved ones. And everyone believed that, and everyone was happy and getting ready for that. And they had a very rigid thing. And this is so much more, to me, I don't know.
Well, remember, it gets more rigid the more you go to the right on the spectrum. So
well, I'm talking about your view.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so again, there are advantages and disadvantages. The advantages, yes, it's very flexible. The disadvantages, where's the authority? Like, what authority do I have? What authority does Judaism have if this doesn't all come from God? I mean, Maimonides, when he does his 13 principles of faith, starts off by saying, you have to believe in God to start with, right? I mean, if you don't believe in God, the whole enterprise falls apart. And that's the problem with Reformed Judaism.
Oh.
I mean, I wouldn't have it any other way, but it does make it difficult.
Yeah, I see.
Because like, if I were a rabbi in an Orthodox community and I'd say, this is what you have to do, you would do it. If I tell my congregants they have to do something, it's like, who are you? All right, we're going to look at the issue of suicide and assisted suicide. Okay. Is suicide against Jewish law? So there's no explicit biblical prohibition, but the rabbis derived a prohibition from the verse in Genesis, and surely your blood of your lives will I require. Rashi and other early rabbinic authorities understood the verse as a prohibition against taking one's own life. Contemporary rulings from all three major religious streams have upheld the view that suicide is fundamentally incompatible with Jewish law and values. Preserving human life is among the highest duties in Judaism, and suicide is seen as counter to this fundamental value. Human beings are barred even from harming themselves, let alone ending their own lives. Moreover, in traditional Jewish thought, the body belongs to God, and as such, ending one's life is not considered to be within the scope of a person's authority. All right, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. So you're not allowed to commit suicide. And if you do commit suicide, theoretically, you're not supposed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. However, there's always a way around things. There's always legal fictions and, loopholes. So what the rabbis say is, if you commit suicide, it means you're not of sound mind. And therefore, you can be excused for having done this. And that's usually how they get around it. So, the person, I mean, I'm not saying that in every case, but I think that's kind of what they're aiming for, is not to exclude somebody. I'm sure people have been excluded, but they do get around it that way. So that's the first thing. Then there's the question of so-called assisted suicide. It used to be called euthanasia, but that's a pretty grim word to use. So we're going to take a look at some of the writings about that. Oops, went too far. Okay, so we're taking it from the Talmud. That's a page from the Talmud, which we will go into much more detail in a few weeks. So the Talmud says, so Rabbi or rabbi, that's the gentleman, Judah Hanasi, who edited the Mishnah, which is the first layer of the Talmud, and he was a very important rabbi. So he seems to be on the verge of death, and the sages decreed a public fast to ask for God's mercy. In other words, to try to keep him alive. And so all of these people are out there praying and praying and praying for this rabbi to keep living, and they're fasting and they're doing all this stuff. And his handmaiden goes up on the roof and prays, "They on high desire Rabbi to join me, and those below desire Rabbi to remain with them. May it be God's will that those below prevail over those above." So in other words, she's agreeing with the students who are trying to pray for him to stay alive. However, she then sees what kind of pain he's in. He's going through horrible, horrible pain. So she prays that may it be God's will that those above prevail over those below. In other words, those who want him to die, win out. But the sages kept praying for this, for God's mercy to keep Rabbi's life alive. And so she took a jar and threw it from the roof to the ground. Startled at the noise made by the smashed jar, the sages ceased their prayers for an instant, and the soul of Rabbi departed. So in other words, she did not want him to suffer as much as she would have liked to have him continue to live. He was suffering. So this is considered basically not putting an impediment in the way of somebody who's going to be dying. It's not artificially keeping a person alive, and it's not removing an artificial thing that keeps them alive. It's simply removing an impediment to the person actually being able to die. So this one relates to what Che was talking about. So there's this Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion, who is another, very important sage in the Talmud, okay? And the Romans were very cruel and did not want the Torah to be taught. And so the rabbis who taught the Torah, which were Rabbi Akiva, this gentleman, a few others, were tortured to death, really horrible. So they bring him out and they wrap him in the Torah scroll, place bundles of vine shoots around him, and set them on fire. So not only is he being burnt alive, but he's being burnt in his Torah scroll, which is even worse. Then they brought tufts of wool, soaked them in water, and placed them over his heart so that he should not expire quickly. In other words, this will keep him going longer. He'll suffer even longer with all these flames around him. His daughter exclaimed, "Oh, Papa, that I should see you in such a state." He replied, If I alone were being burned, it would have been hard for me to bear. But now that I'm burning together with the Torah scroll, he who will have regard for the humiliation of the Torah will also have regard for my humiliation. His disciples called out, Rabbi, what do you see? He answered, sheets of parchment being burned, but the letters on them soaring on high. The disciples, open your mouth so that the fire will enter into you more quickly and put an end to your agony. You know, the more oxygen he can bring into his body. And Rabbi Hanina says, let him who gave me my soul take it away. In other words, I'm not going to hasten my death because it's up to God. God gave me my soul. God can take it away. No one has a right to put an end to his own life. The executioner then said to him, Master, if I raise the flame and take away the tufts of wool from over your heart, will you bring me into the life of the world to come? Yes, the rabbi says, swear to me. Rabbi Hanina swore to him. Hearing that, the executioner raised the flame and removed the tufts of wool from over his heart, and Rabbi Hanina's soul departed quickly. The executioner then jumped up and threw himself into the fire. A divine voice exclaimed, both Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion and his executioner have been assigned to the world to come. So let's just kind of unpack that. It's a very difficult story because here's this executioner who's a horrible person. And because he does one act of mercy, he gets to, you know, enter the world to come along with all these righteous people. You know, that's not fair. And yet that happens, right? It happens that God will somehow, somebody who doesn't deserve it will have a nice life, even though they don't deserve it. Tough. There are stories like that in the Talmud as well about like Rabbi Akiva, who was flayed alive. I just saw a film last night. It's called Resistance. Has anybody heard about it? About Marcel Marceau, who was a very famous mime in France, and who apparently, you know, worked for the resistance during the war. And there's a scene in there, I don't know if it's based on a true story or not, but these two sisters who are working for the resistance, and they catch the two sisters, and are trying to get them to say where the men are. And Klaus Barbie, who was the guy who ran the south of France at that time for the Nazis, takes one of the sisters into this room and describes what being flayed alive is like, and how they try to keep you as conscious as possible for as long as possible so you really suffer. And he said, but I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to do it to your sister in front of you. And I don't know, I just like closed my eyes, but I think he did do it. I mean, being flayed alive is I can't even imagine anything worse. So that's what happened to Rabbi Akiva. And it's wrapped in a story of Moses being up on Mount Sinai and watching God put crowns on the letters. And Moses says, oh, what are those crowns? And God says, one day there's going to be a man who will interpret even the crowns on the letters of the Torah. And Moses says, oh, let me see this person. Can I see this person? So he's transported into the future, into Rabbi Akiva's classroom. And Rabbi Akiva is expounding on the Torah and giving all sorts of interpretations. And Moses is totally confused. He has no idea what the guy's talking about. And finally, one of the students says, where did you learn all this from? And Akiva says, from Moses. This is the way the rabbis give themselves the permission to interpret and to say that it came from Mount Sinai, the interpretation as much as anything else. So Moses comes back and says to God, well, what is the reward for someone like this? And God says, take a look. And he shows him the Roman marketplace where they're weighing Akiva's flesh. And Moses says, how can this be the reward for somebody like him? And God says, be quiet, such is my will. Now, of course, this is written by human beings. It's not written by God. That doesn't mean that that's how God is at all, but that's how they understood it, because these guys were suffering so much under the Roman Empire. But fairness, the executioner being able to go to heaven or whatever, along with this very righteous rabbi. Is that fair? No. Is Akiva being flayed alive fair? No. But that's life, unfortunately. But as far as the assisted suicide question is concerned, again, impediments to somebody dying can be removed. But for example, there was a big discussion. Remember Terry Chiavo? She was a woman in Florida. She was in, I think, a terrible car accident. She was kind of basically a vegetable. And she was on life support, including a feeding tube. And I think it was her husband who wanted to disconnect her and her parents who didn't. And different movements of Judaism determined different decisions about it. Because if the feeding tube is considered, like really life-sustaining food, then you don't remove that. But if you consider it to be a medical device that's like a heroic measure, then maybe it can be considered something you can remove. But the different branches of Judaism don't agree on that. I want to show you the responsum from the Reform movement, because I don't agree with it at all. So if you want my opinion on that, I'm happy to share it. So that's the next. Okay, so there's something called responsa literature, which is when people have a question, a legal question, they will go to a higher authority to get an answer. So does Jewish tradition recognize the quality of life as a factor in determining medical and general care to preserve and prolong life? The answer is the considerations which govern euthanasia, and again, we don't call it euthanasia anymore, but that's what it was called at the time, have been discussed by the committee in a recent response. And the conclusion stated, we would not endorse any positive steps leading toward death. We would recommend pain-killing drugs, which would ease the remaining days of a patient's life. We would reject any general endorsement of euthanasia, but where all independent life has ceased and where the above mentioned criteria of death have been met, further medical support systems need not be continued. The individual who seeks relief from her pain should receive drugs which may help, even though they may slightly hasten death. As this is a very long-term process, the drug cannot be seen as actually causing her death. Suffering itself has never been seen as an independent good by Judaism. It's clear that in each of these cases and in others like them, we should do our best to enhance the quality of life and to use whatever means modern science has placed at our disposal for this purpose. We need not invoke heroic measures to prolong life, nor should we hesitate to alleviate pain, but we can also not utilize a low quality of life as an excuse for hastening death. Okay, so the Reform movement, just like all other religious entities, do not believe in hastening death. Like, okay, Dr. Kevorkian, no. If you're suffering and you're saying, I only have so many months to live, and I know it's going to be really painful and torturous to live those months with whatever condition it is I have. I would like to end my life now and not have to go through that. Judaism does not endorse that. Now, I personally do. And it really bothers me that, because there was a long research paper that was done about that, either this was based on or other responsa were based on, basically saying, well, suffering is part of life. And, so I don't get it. I just don't get it. There are people who've been in really awful conditions. For example, there was a guy in France, he was a fireman, and he was quite young, like, in his early 20s, and he got into a terrible car accident and was completely paralyzed, his entire body. And I can't remember if he could do one of three things. Either I don't think he could speak. I'm not sure he could hear, maybe he could see. And he could maybe move an eyelash or something like that. And he ended up writing a book, believe it or not, in that condition. Basically asking the president of France to let him die. Because, what kind of life is that? And, the kind of life where also you're in this facility, and at a certain point, they realized there's nothing more they can do for him, and he was just going to be warehoused. And his mother had basically quit her job and moved to the facility, or near the facility where this man was living, to take care of him. Well, she wasn't going to be alive forever to do that. Plus, he didn't want to ruin her life. And he finally convinced her to put some drugs in his IV. This was after like 3 or 4 years. And so she facilitated his suicide. They arrested her. I'm not sure whatever actually happened to her. I need to look that up. But yes, Beverly.
To just share a story.
Mhm.
My brother, whose lover, Michael, they were very, very close, been together a long time, and Michael got AIDS, and he got very sick very quickly. And I remember they were living in Laguna, and I had lived with my suitcase packed in case my brother needed me. And I remember going there and seeing Michael, and I didn't even recognize him. It was so, and Barry was just holding on to him and holding on. And I said, you need to let him go. And he died the next day.
Mm.
It was so powerful, that thing of like, he just really needed to say goodbye so that he could go on, So
Yeah.
that was my experience with that. And I never forgot it,
Yeah.
that sometimes you need to let people go.
Right. Right. I mean, to me, suffering with some terminal illness is not really, worth living for. But I mean, that would be my choice. If it's somebody else's choice to do it, that's up to them.
Yeah.
Yes, Christine.
Yes, slightly different. There are many stories about altruistic suicide, where someone gives their life in order to help other people live, and in situations of great duress. And, I think Primo Levi goes through a couple of instances of that in Auschwitz, and a lot of other sort of crisis situations where people sacrifice themselves in order to let others live. Lots of mothers do this for children in war, and that kind of thing. So to me, that's fine. That's a decision, but it's a decision for life. It's just that it's life for a community, not necessarily for yourself. So have people weighed in on this?
Well, during the medieval period, a lot of people committed suicide and killed their children rather than have Christians either convert them or torture them or whatever they were going to do. And it was done for the purpose of Kiddush Hashem, which is for the glory of God. There are 3 circumstances under which you can die instead of doing them. Okay, these are the exceptions to suicide. And that is being forced into idolatry, sexual impropriety, and murder. So if any of those are things that you're faced with, you can choose death over that. In fact, you're supposed to choose death. So when the Crusades were going on in the Middle Ages and Christians were trying to convert Jews or force them into whatever, slavery or whatever, a lot of people chose to kill themselves instead. I'm not saying that I advocate that, but that was their choice and they're not condemned for that. As I said, it's considered to be Kiddush Hashem. Other questions or comments? I mean, I wrote a bit about assisted suicide or death with dignity. I think that's a better term for it. And actually, I did quite a bit of lobbying to get the law in California changed, which it did. But the problem with the law in California is that you have to have, I think, 6 months to live, and you have to self-administer. So what do you do if you have some illness where you can't, use your limbs? Now, there's a congregant in our congregation who had ALS. This is a really sad story. Got ALS within the first year of being married and having a child. And he said, that if he couldn't live at home, that he didn't want to continue. And the minute they had to put a respirator in or a ventilator, he couldn't live at home because you need to have a therapist around to make sure it works properly. But he chose to live. And the only thing he can do is move his eyebrows. So, I think about that. I think, oh my God, please, I don't want to have to live like that. But you don't know until you're in the situation, right? And you have a child. And but it's also incredibly expensive, right? You have to be in a facility. You have to have your own staff, because if you don't have your own staff, they will not respond in time. And there's a lot of hospital visits, and the insurance company is not very keen on supporting this person, as you can imagine. So then you have questions of, well, whose life is worth more than somebody else's life, right? If it's costing a fortune to keep this person alive, but then there's not enough money to keep other people alive, what do you do? Those are really huge moral dilemmas. But as I said, with the Terry Chavo case, there were different opinions from the different movements. And as always, the conservative movement kind of had both yes and no. In other words, they're always like sort of split. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Beverly.
Such an interesting topic to me, but I just like to get your sense about this, because we are living with so much death right now. And in a way, you have to be either numb to it, or it's hard to figure out how to respond. 10,000, 450,000. Is there some kind of a grieving process for us to,
for our country
to go through? I mean, I think that Judaism could offer something for people. Do you know what I mean? It feels like it's going to come back to bite us in the butt when it is.
Well, there have been services, talking about it, and poems and prayers that have been written, sometimes specifically about what's going on, sometimes incorporated into the service generally. Yeah. I mean, we've, as a people, we've been through a lot of really tough times. So we do have some ways of coping with it, and maybe we need to do more.
The poet laureate's going to say a poem for all the dead before the Super Bowl.
Great.
That's good to know.
Christine.
That's good. Well, if it helps. Yeah.
I had a question. In my Holocaust studies, I read a book by a woman who was a doctor at one of the camps, and to save the lives of mothers, women who came to the camps pregnant but not visibly pregnant, she drowned the babies when they were born. So what would the view of that kind of thing be, where you're saving the mother?
Oh, well, first of all, let me just say that as far as abortion is concerned, Judaism has a much sort of more liberal definition of when it's okay to have an abortion. So we don't consider life to begin at conception. The life of the baby becomes significant once the majority of the body comes out of the mother. Until that point, the mother's life takes precedent, which is not exactly the situation you're telling me, unless you're talking about drowning the baby before it's come to full term. But so in terms of abortion, if the body has not come out entirely, then, I mean, obviously we don't condone, abortion at 9 months, but I'm just saying that this comes from in Exodus. It says that, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. But if somebody knocks a pregnant woman over and she loses the baby, it's not life for life. So they're saying it's not a life yet at that point, right? Because otherwise it would be a life that you'd have to give. So it's more liberal when it comes to, deciding if an abortion is okay. And so they use, one of the principles they use is called a rodef. So somebody who's coming after you to kill you, you're allowed to turn around and kill them before they kill you, okay? So that's how they consider a problematic pregnancy. So if the baby or the fetus is somehow threatening the mother, it's threatening her life, then, you know, it's okay to abort to save her life, right? Now, you're talking, I don't know if you're talking about a baby that's come to full term and it's being drowned. I doubt that that would be something that generally would be okay, but obviously the circumstances are such that exceptions are made, right? I can't even imagine having to make that kind of decision, you know? Yeah, Christine Gailey.
I'm not sure if that's the same person that who later became a pro bono gynecologist in New York. Her name was Gisela Perl. And Dr. Pearl wrote a really incredible sort of memoir of her time in Auschwitz and being forced into Mengele's clinic and then performing abortions at night so that the women would not be sent to the chambers, well, at least for that time. And she later, you know, did a lot of sort of help for women when abortions were illegal in this country so that their lives would not be ruined. Okay, so Gisela Pearl fell afoul of the US government when she applied for citizenship. And of course, the US was anti-abortion. They found out that she had performed maybe 3,000 abortions in Auschwitz and went to deport her. And the word got out in the Lower East Side. She was in New York, the Lower East Side, and a lot of women who had survived the camps and come to the United States after the refugee camps, or the whatever they were called at that point, they came up to the hearing, the deportation hearing, and insisted on being heard that she had made it possible for them to have children later on.
Wow.
And so she was, in fact, granted citizenship. So anyway, she was my gynecologist in New York, by the way.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, just an astonishing woman.
It's really
of course,
a Sophie's choice, right?
She was German, you know, by origin, or Viennese, and of course she had the bedside manner of most German doctors at the time, which is like none. Right. But, you know, she looks inside of you and says, "You look like hamburger," you know, "Oh, thank you." You know, like zero bedside manner, but just a remarkable human being.
Actually, for Yom HaShoah, for Holocaust Remembrance Day, I'm bringing somebody to speak who has written a book about German women during the war. So it'd be a different, interesting angle. And then this film Resistance, which one of our congregants wants to pay for to let everybody see it. Yeah, it's pretty upsetting. I mean, Marcel Marceau, I had no idea that he had done all this work with the Resistance, and really risking his life on many occasions to take kids out of France. But okay, any last questions or comments before we go off to the Super Bowl?
So there's no other way to see that movie, Resistance? There's no way.
Actually, you can see it on either Hulu or Showtime or whatever. I think you have to pay a premium amount, but it's available on all those services. Okay. It's very upsetting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Sasha, did you want to?
I may have missed this in the reading, so I'm sorry, but I just wanted to know if when someone dies in Judaism, you say something different than you do in Christianity, you know, may their death have been for a blessing. And I just was wondering if you could talk, sorry if I missed it, that you already covered that, but I was just wondering where that comes from and if there's a bigger
we say may their memories be a blessing.
May their memory be for a blessing.
May their memory be a blessing, right.
Where does that come from in the Jewish tradition?
I actually don't know. I'll have to look it up. I just say it, but I never thought about where it came from. I'll look it up and let you know. That was the thing I was the most afraid of when I was going to be ordained. I thought people are going to ask me questions and I won't know the answer. But you know what? There's only so much you can know, right?
Exactly. Don't worry. Thank you for.
I will let everybody know.
Thanks.
All right. Well, enjoy the Super Bowl. And we'll see you next week. Hopefully a less grim topic than this one. This is really grim.
This is great.
Yeah, but
We can do a postmortem on the game.
might have to, yeah. But no, but I mean, I have to say, really, in Judaism, I think there's a real sensitivity to the different stages of mourning, and to really, kind of give people a container for how to deal with it. And what's interesting is people who are not generally very observant, once something like this happens, they'll say, "What do I do?" And it really helps to have things to do. That these are the stages you go through, and here are the things that you have to do. So. Hopefully we won't have to use this with any of you anytime soon, but you'll know a little more about it if you do. All right, I'll see you next week. Well, or if you can come to our bar mitzvah on Friday, that would be a good thing for you to experience. It'll be at 6:30 on Friday. And oh, I see, is Christina? I guess Christina went back to sleep. Okay. But yeah, so I would say, yes, definitely try to attend the bar mitzvah, because we're not doing it the way we normally do it. Normally we have a Friday night and then Saturday morning. Well, he's not going to do Saturday morning. So he's going to chant from the Torah on Friday night. And that's something that, you won't see all that much. So try to do it.
Rabbi, could you send the link?
The link? Sure. It's the same every week, but I'll send it again.
For the Friday?
Yeah, it's the same every week for every Friday, but I'll send it again. That's fine.
Okay. All right, great.
I think I did send it earlier.
You did.
Right. Yeah, I reminded people. Yeah, I reminded people of what the that we were having a class today. But I'm going to send you a PDF of the slides, and I'll send the link again.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Have a nice
Bye.
night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Toda
Bye,
rabba,
guys.
Rabbi. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.